Good morning. It is wonderful to be here with you on April 12th as we wrap up our book series in the book of 1 Timothy. If you've been with us the last couple of weeks, we need to do a quick review. If this is your first time here, you might be surprised how I feel about 1 Timothy. It's not very positive. And the reason being is if you go back 1,700 years in church history, you will arrive at the early church councils. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what the councils discussed and how they discussed it. We do know what they decided at the end of these church councils that took place so long ago. But kind of a byproduct of those meetings is they started making lists about which books should be in the New Testament. And these church councils never officially decided this, but they essentially said if somebody met Jesus firsthand, then they should get a book in the New Testament if they wrote it and we have it. So this is why the Apostle Paul, who met Jesus on the road to Damascus after Jesus' resurrection, was allowed to write so many different books of the New Testament. And his books came from going around the Mediterranean Sea and setting up churches, and then he'd write letters to these churches as they faced specific problems. Now, in church tradition, there are 13 letters that are attributed to Paul. There are 27 books of the Bible that are in the New Testament. Almost half of them are all written by Paul. And this was the way the church understood that Paul the Apostle spoke to these churches, so long ago, and it's something that has been holy and sacred for the church ever since then. Until modern archaeology and the scientific method came along. And through archaeology and literary analysis and several other reasons, which we talked about in the first part of this series, most scholars today believe that Paul wrote these 7 letters in the New Testament. They are called the undisputed letters. There is some debate as to whether or not Paul wrote these 3 other letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. It's pretty split within the scholarly community. And then almost everyone in the scholarly community, although not all, believe that Paul did not write 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And we gave those reasons, a couple weeks ago, but that essentially is the way it's written and what it talks about and the events it references don't line up with the life of Paul in the same timeline. So who we think wrote 1 Timothy a long time ago was a bunch of insecure men who really wanted to shore up their power and make sure that people listen to them. So this letter is all about how you should trust your church leaders no matter what they do. And if that sounds problematic to you, I want you to know it is. And whenever we talk about 1 Timothy, we should always have this question in the back of our head, which is, should 1 Timothy even be in the Bible? Because the answer is not really. If the qualification is that Paul, who's an apostle, wrote it, and that's why it's in the New Testament, if we have new evidence that tells us that Paul didn't write it, it's worth talking about it not being in the New Testament. The second thing we need to talk about is the fact that this thesis is problematic, to say the least, which we've talked about several times over the past couple weeks. The thesis of 1 Timothy is stated both at the beginning and end of this letter, and you'll find it in verse 3 of chapter 1 when the author writes, "I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people not to teach different teachings." And apparently, in this letter, there are people who are spreading false teachings, things that are harmful to the church, and the author wants to put an end to that. And then at the end of this letter, 1 Timothy, Paul restates, I'm sorry, I said Paul, it's not Paul. The authors of this letter restate their thesis when they say, "Dear Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you." And while we don't know what the false teaching was, we can imagine a world where we actually support the letter that's written here, because we can say, if false teaching is that there are some people God loves and not everyone, that's a false teaching that should be stopped. But when you look closely at the letter and you make an outline, you realize that the method for which the author wants this false teaching to stop is something that you and I typically disagree with. For instance, if we make this outline, it talks about how if we accept our sinful nature as human beings, then we can stop false teaching. We should demonize our enemies, pray for obedience, silence all women, which we talked about last week, doubly honor elders, slavery is God's plan, dissenters are conceited, and keep the religious rule. And look at that, the third TV came back. Submit to church authority, reject new ideas, condemn false widows, which widows can remarry and which ones can't. So when you look at this outline and you say to yourself, okay, what is he trying to do here, this author? it seems to go against what we know to be good and the work of God today. But today is the last part of this sermon series. And I want us to look at this restated thesis, Dear Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, and see if we can pull something different out today. After all, we've been talking about how this letter paints a picture of unhealthy church. Is it possible then, on this last part of this series, we could talk about what healthy church looks like? Because when we are saying that we are part of the Christian tradition, it means that we've inherited something. So what is that thing, and is it worth guarding that which has been entrusted to us? I am 41 years old, and I have a lot of memories of my grandparents, and I love my grandparents. These are my maternal grandparents, Roland and Rosella, and these are my paternal grandparents, Henry and Bonnie, who we called Papa and Bonnie. Yes, my grandmother wanted to go by her first name. Everyone thinks it's super weird. That's our family. But I think often about how these four individuals that I loved with my whole heart and felt love in return, what they would think of Paradox Church. Because they all went to church, they all dedicated their lives to church, and if they could somehow become aware of this, would they feel like I had been guarding what had been entrusted to me from my heritage, not just my spiritual heritage, but also my familial heritage? And when I think about that, there's a question that arises in regards to this verse, which is, what has been entrusted to me, and have I actually guarded it? And while that may be strange language to say you need to guard some things, you need to protect things that have been entrusted to you, can we imagine or can we accept that there are things that are worth guarding? I would tell you, when I look at this picture of my grandfather and grandmother, I look at these pink pants, and I wish that my grandfather would have entrusted those to me to guard, because that would have been real nice to guard those. I can't believe he pulled that off with such confidence, to be quite honest. But can you imagine things that have been handed to you? Whether it's a material object, an idea, a way of thinking, or a religion that is worth guarding that you feel like has been entrusted to you. And if we bring this back to this thesis, that is a thesis that I disagree with when you consider the whole letter, can we imagine a church that's worth guarding, that we've been entrusted with? And when we talk about the first book of 1 Timothy, it's one thing to just destroy, critique, to tear down. It's another thing to start talking about, but what are we building? One of my favorite authors who's currently writing articles for The Atlantic is a man named Derek Thompson. He, along with an author from the New York Times, wrote a book that just came out a couple weeks ago called Abundance. And while I have not read the book, I heard him interviewed on a podcast where he was talking about the whole idea behind the book Abundance. Now, Derek Thompson is a registered Democrat, and he is a participant in the Democratic Party. And the book, he said, is about how the Democratic Party needs to get back to building things. He said, we often, as a political party, like to tell everyone that we're all about affordable housing, but then when we have cities that are run by Democratic mayors and Democratic politicians, cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York, we don't build affordable housing. We just allow housing to keep going up and up and up. We need to start building these houses and make them affordable so that we can actually call ourselves the party of affordable housing. And what I loved about this interview is it delineated the idea between theory and actually building something. I am so grateful for so much of the education that I received in preparation to become a pastor, but there's a big difference between the classroom and what actually works out in the real world, right? And when I hear about progressive Christians and Christians who have the most cutting-edge ideas about what Christianity needs to be, they often start an Instagram page or a YouTube channel, and they love to sit on the sidelines and talk about what church should be without actually ever trying to start a church. And there's a big difference between what church should be and what church looks like in a real society with real ends and real means and real people and trying to get them all on the same page. And there's one of my favorite proverbs as a saying. It's attributed as a Jewish proverb, but the saying goes like this: any donkey can tear down a barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. And when we talk about church and what healthy church is, there is a big difference between the thoughts about it and actually building it. I learned the difference between this donkey proverb here in a big way when we started our church all the way back on February 20 of 2016. And this isn't something we like to brag about because it's not worth bragging about, but our highest attendance ever at Paradox was on day one. So I don't know if we just made everybody angry or they were like bored or whatever it was, but that was the highest attendance. And I feel like the reason why it was the biggest attendance was because as we were talking to people and hearing people before and after the service, I realized that a lot of people were there to see if I would trash my old employer and the denomination I came from. In other words, there was this question in the air: are you here to kick down the barn, or are you here to build a new barn? And there's a big difference between those two things. And when I think about who I was back in 2016 when we started this church and who we were as a church, there was a lot of joy in starting this. But ultimately, all of this started not to say, oh, they're wrong and they're bad. It all started because not only I, but we all really believed in church. And if you knew me back in 2016 and even 2015, you would hear me say something like this, and you would say, Craig, aren't you the guy just like 3 weeks before this church opened that was sitting in another church crying your eyeballs out because they hurt you so bad? And I'd say, yeah, but I still believe in church. And since that time, 9 years ago, till today, I have to tell you, I still really believe in church. I still believe that this is a worthwhile practice and that a healthy church is possible even if it's imperfect. And when we talk about that, for the past 9 years, I've been obsessed with what makes a church healthy. Because it's something I've thought about every week and talked about with staff and with elders, with trustees, with personnel committees. What is it that makes a church healthy and worth being a part of? What is a church that's worth believing in? And so in preparation of this sermon, I tried to think of all the things that make a healthy church. I think I missed some, but I came up with 11 different things that make a healthy church. Why 11, you ask? I was going for 10, and I felt like I left one out. So that's it. Nothing magical about that. But we're going to talk about 11 things that make church healthy. Does that sound good to you this morning? Okay, 4 of you are excited. I hope I can get at least 11 by the end of the sermon. So anyways, I want to tell you a story. I have heard a lot of pastors step down from church ministry. I love to listen to these sermons where they're saying goodbye to their congregation. I love it because I find it fascinating because it's almost like this is the last thing I want to leave you with. And there's this consistent pattern I've heard from pastors that is a bit of a pet peeve for mine. If they're leaving the church and they're leaving ministry, like they're going to go do something else and pick a different vocation, almost always a pastor will stand up in front of their congregation and say something like this: I'm sleeping in next Sunday and enjoying breakfast with my family. I hate this line. The reason I hate this line is because essentially the pastor is saying, sleeping in is way better than being here at church with all of you. I'd much rather not be here, and I've been hiding it for years, and now I'm finally free from you all. But when I think about Paradox, I have to tell you something. Pastors love to act like martyrs, like, oh, this is a hard job, but I'm doing it for the Lord. I want to tell you something. I love this job. I love it. I love almost everything about this job, and I cannot wait for Saturday every week. And you may say, how is that possible? Well, I not only love this job, I love Saturdays. And when you say, why do you love Saturdays so much? It's easy, right? I love the music, the liturgists, the chai, the food, the sacraments, the fellowship, the kids, the youth ministries, and the people. I'm hanging out with my friends on Saturday. And as much fun as the office is during the week, it's a little bit better when we're all here together, right? I love all of it. And you may say, really, Craig, all of it? Because you've had some tough times. I would say, yes, I have always loved it, even in the tough times. The great Julius Erving once said these words: being a professional is doing the things you love to do on the days you don't feel like doing them. Have there been days I don't feel like being a pastor? Of course. But being a professional reminds myself that I love this, and I will even do it on days I don't feel like being a pastor. And so I can say that I've always loved it, even if there's days I felt like I haven't wanted to do it. And when I look at this church and what we do, whether it's social events or Saturday church or Saturday afternoons, when I think about what a healthy church is, I think this is the number one thing. And this is where you're going to say, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard said in church. It's so obvious. A healthy church loves spending time together. Can I get an amen? If you don't, it's probably not a healthy church. If you're going to church and be like, oh, these people, why? Like, I love the sermons, but these people. It's not a healthy church. If you love spending time with the people in the church, the community you're at, it is a healthy church. Now, if we go back before our church was founded, we were a young adult group called Shadow Ministries. Did anybody go to the Shadow? This is a long time ago. Yes, a few of us are still here. We're still here, is all I'll say. Now, after Shadow ended, we stepped out because we felt like God was calling us to start a church. And while people romanticize that process, nobody really talks about what happens next when you start a church, which is you have to write some bylaws so the state will grant you 501c3 so that way you can accept donations. That's just the way the church works in 2025. Now, this is the cover of our church bylaws. We worked on this for months, a founding board did, and you may say, that looks very boring. Are there any other pictures? No, there's no pictures in the church bylaws, everyone. It is a very boring document. And it delineates who does what, who's responsible for what happens when there's a problem, how we hold people accountable, all that. And while these pages look boring, they describe positions that we filled with volunteers that include people on our personnel committee and our elder board that oversees the spiritual health of the church and our trustees boards that oversees all of the finances and the facilities. And I will tell you this, if you ever come across somebody that's like, oh, I just love my church, you're like, well, tell me about your church. Like, well, we don't do structure, man. We're just all free. It's like, it's not a good church. It's always going to explode. And the reason why is because there has to be systems in place that help guide you when you have to make some very difficult decisions. And I have found that a healthy church always stands on a well-defined structure composed of committed volunteers. And once we had that, we put together Paradox Church. We've had several people serve on elder boards, trustee boards, personnel boards. And these groups together have hidden all of these different conversations, have made it so that we can worry about this and act on them in a very healthy way. So while the structure is something we don't talk about often, it is necessary to a healthy organization. Now, if we go back to the Shadow, the third thing that I want to tell you about with Healthy Church is we started doing a series where we were going to go through every book of the Bible as a young adult group. So we started this in 2013. We were going through it. And if you're wondering, how were sermons at Shadow different than sermons at Paradox today? It's very simple. It's very similar, except for the fact that I referenced the Fast and the Furious way more at Shadow. Because it was a college-age ministry, and I figured college students love Fast and the Furious, and I loved it too. Anyways, we were doing this college-age ministry, and I'll never forget, all of a sudden I look up, and Manfred Schroer has joined our group, who is not in college, if anyone's not sure. So Manfred, I saw him, his daughter brought him to this college ministry, and I talked to Manfred. He kept showing up week after week. I was talking about Dom Toretto and Brian and their relationship. It was great. But I remember talking to Manfred, and I was like, why do you like this? Like, why are you enjoying this college ministry? And while I don't remember the exact words, I ran this by Manfred to make sure I got it right, and he said this is pretty close. He remembers this conversation. He said to me, I've gone to church my whole life, Craig, and I've listened to a lot of sermons. I've never heard any church preach on the biblical stories we discuss during our sermons. We talk about the real obscure stuff. And before I could text him back, Manfred then followed it up and said, "Yes, Craig, that's right, and today I feel even more so." Now, bit of a review. We went through all 66 books of the Bible from 2013 to 2022. This church is so nerdy that we decided to do it again. And so in 2024, we started another 9-year sermon series through the same Bible. And a big reason we had doubts about doing this series again was that we were worried that it would feel like a retread or feel like it was the same thing. But here's Manfred just yesterday texting me and saying, "Even today, I feel even more so." And when you consider that and what it means and how we study the Bible is filled with stories. Some are very easy to grasp and talk about. There are other stories, other passages, other writings that are very difficult. But this approach to the Bible represents how we approach all of life, which is a healthy church trusts that God can be found everywhere, even in the worst parts of the Bible. 1 Timothy. Everywhere we go in this book, we can find something to talk about that inspires us to reimagine the divine in a way that is both honoring the past and true to today. Another thing that happens at this church that I'm really proud of is we really try to prioritize biblical scholarship. And we've invited Maury Jackson to come and speak. We've invited other people who have very fancy degrees, and we have loved having them here. I also try my best to bring my academic education into the sermons. And we also don't just do that with sermons, but we also do it with music. And we ask our musicians to learn some really hard songs because we like the lyrics and the theology they present. But when I think about what this represents and trying to get the right language and figuring that out, one comment that I hear so frequently from people in this church is people will say to me, "I just learn so much every time I come to this church." I've also heard a comment of, "You really make me think when you preach." And I think when we are surprised by the fact that church would make us think or that we could learn something at church, it shows us how much we've assumed that spirituality, the practice of religion, is something boring or should be predictable. But in my opinion, the healthiest forms of spirituality are ones that reposture you, change the way that you look at the world so that you are looking at the world in a way that expects wonder. So for me, a healthy church invites all of us to live with a posture of wonder, to live in a way where we expect to learn something new, where we expect to be surprised, where we expect for something brand new to come our way. And when I think about how the church has related to science and how much of a mistake that's been, the church has looked at science very suspiciously, and it's all done in an effort to try to say, like, well, we don't want to do anything new. That's the wrong direction for a healthy church. Science should push us to say, wow, that changes the way we perceive God, and we need to rethink things, but isn't it exciting to learn something new? I was recently reading a book by a woman named Barbara Brown Taylor, and she was teaching a college course at a small Christian college in Georgia, and she wrote a book called Holy Envy, and the college course was about world religions. And she said that a lot of students took her class assuming that the whole point of world religions was so that she could educate them about why all the other religions are wrong and Christianity is right. But she didn't teach it that way. Instead, she wanted to create empathy and understanding and even view other religions as teachers. And so she would take her kids on a field trip, yes, even in college, to local different religious bodies. And while there, they would listen from and learn from people of different religions. So one of my favorite stories in this book is she takes her kids, her college students, to a Dharma hall in a Buddhist monastery. And at the Dharma hall, a monk will come out and teach. And his teaching that day, when she brought the students, was a teaching called Cultivating Happiness. And the Buddhist monk taught about how you can live your life in a way that is happier and less ridden with guilt or anxiety. And as the students were listening to this talk, one student turned to Barbara Brown Taylor and kind of said with shock in their eyes, "This teaching is just about life." And then afterwards, exited the room and talked to her and said, what about our beliefs? And Barbara Brown Taylor was really surprised by that because she's like, I actually like when we talk about life. And it reminds her of the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus gave thousands of years ago, a sermon in which Jesus talked about loving our enemies and living with less anger and being kinder to people in ways that are driven by compassion rather than judgment. And when I think about how we do things at Paradox, we have people who believe so many different things here. And if we were to stand up and start saying things like, hey, we're all going to die, and you got to get your mental furniture arranged in the correct way to avoid death, that would be an unhealthy church, because it would ultimately be saying the most important thing is the way you think. It's not the way you act and what you do. And I have found that a healthy church mirrors this Sermon on the Mount to the best of its abilities when a healthy church is much more interested in eternal life now than eternal life later. A church that is much more interested in how we live and love now and forgive now, rather than saying oh, it's all bad, it will be better later. That's a much healthier expression of the faith. And I try my best as a pastor and as a church, we try our best to invite people to not have to suspend their judgment or their beliefs in order to be here at this church. We hope that everyone can get something out of this, whether they're Christian, atheist, agnostic, or part of another religion. And when I think about this church and how it has moved and grown, one thing that we say every week at the church is we talk about how sermons here at the Paradox start discussions, they don't end them, right? We say it every week. And the reason we say it every week is because there's this expectation that you have to agree with everything the pastor says. But let's think about what this means for you and me personally. More importantly, it's more that we are interested in hearing what you have to say as well. And if you disagree with what I say, that's more than fine. But we'd love to hear what it is that you believe. I once was speaking with a friend who goes to a church in another state. And he was talking to me about how discouraged he was with his church. And I asked him why it was, and he told me that he just sits there and the pastor says things that he doesn't agree with, and he kind of has to just smile and nod to all of it and listen to this sermon week in and week out, and it's just really hard for him to go. And as I was talking to him, I eventually asked him, so what would happen if they passed a microphone to everyone in the congregation and everyone could share what they actually believed? He said, the church would be no more. And I think that's a really interesting test for churches, right? Imagine if we stopped the service and invited everyone to share what they believed about God and life and what's moral. It would be a long service, but at the same time, assuming there's no hate speech, do you think we as a church could still get along and still accept people for who they are? I think we could. I think if we passed the microphone and asked people to share what they believed, I think that our church has done a good job at understanding that not everybody believes things the same way that we do. And so when people stand up and share things, whether it's letters to their kids or why they love Paradox or other things that they personally believe, I hope that they feel like they're being their authentic selves rather than trying to say things that we want to hear. In my opinion, a healthy church passes the microphone test. The idea that everyone can say what it is that they believe, and even if we're not on the same page, which we're not, we can all say, I feel accepted and loved here for what I am and who I am, rather than who you need me to be. Now, a few weeks ago, I went out to coffee with a couple. I hadn't met them before. We just got a request. Their names were Karen and Alora. And I sat down with them. They had been to our church 1 week, and they were just about the most excited people I had ever encountered to be part of Paradox Church. They told me all about how they enjoyed it, how they felt validated, how they loved the music, how they were excited to be here. And I was like, well, I hope we're good next week. I mean, you've only been to 1 week. You never know, right? But they told me, as I was sitting down with coffee with them, and they told me I could share this story with you all, they told me about how their families, when they heard about Paradox Church and how it worked, they told their families, like, oh yeah, we're going to go meet with the pastor of this church. And their families were like, what? You can meet with the pastor already? You've only gone for 1 week. And what their family did not know at the time is about 3 weeks after I met with them, they would be leading us all in communion, for crying out loud, which is kind of a big deal, right? And the reason we do this and we try to get to know people up front is because we believe that rather than holding judgment or saying like, okay, we're going to wait till you really invest before we start investing in you, I think healthy churches rush toward inclusion, right? Rush toward this idea that we'll open our arms wider and welcomes people quickly rather than just trying to figure out if they're the right kind of fit. So, a healthy church rushes toward inclusion, and this is why, Solange's baptism was so moving just a few weeks ago. Baptism is inclusion. And the more that we can include people, the more that we can say, yes, you are who God has created you to be, the more our church can exist as a healthy congregation. Now, there is a downside to rushing toward inclusion, right? And that is you are opening your heart, and anytime you open your heart, you are opening yourself to be vulnerable and also opening yourself to pain. One of my favorite poems is by Rupi Kaur, who once wrote this. She said, I don't know why I split myself open for others, knowing sewing myself up hurts this much afterwards. And we've had those days that we've opened our arms to inclusion too quickly, and things have gone wrong. This is why things can hurt in a church world, right? But it is work that is worth doing, and we gather every week to remind ourselves that even if we've been hurt, we will continue to open our hearts because that is the way of the gospel. A few months ago, I was getting coffee with John Ariano Jackson and his wife, Raquel. And if you don't know John and Raquel, they have 2 sons, Emil and Mateo. And we were getting coffee with John and Raquel, and I was talking to John, and he was saying, it's a bizarre experience going to church. I was like, why is that? And he said to me, because on Saturday I leave church, and I'm like, there is hope, there is love, things can be better. And then on Monday, I'm driving to work, and I think to myself, there is no hope, things can't be better, it's only going to get worse. Now, if you don't know John is a public defender in the San Bernardino County court system for juveniles. That, my friends, is gospel-oriented work. Can I get an amen? Of course, you're going to be discouraged if you go to that job, right? And yet, it is also one of the most necessary things, doing the right thing that we need in our society. And when I think about John and my conversation with him, he talked about what healthy church is. A healthy church will ground you in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And while we have different understandings of what that word means, I hope that every week you come here feeling discouraged, feeling like you can't see anything good in the world, and then you leave saying, maybe hope is worth it. Maybe it is worth it to love our enemies. Maybe things can be better. And we come here every week with the expectation that maybe my spirit will be renewed, and even though it's difficult out there, maybe things can still get better. And so we celebrate stories of things getting better, we celebrate stories of love, and then we also take communion together now every week to remind ourselves that we are grounded in the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we are children of God, and that love can win even if it doesn't feel like it. I've seen an enormous amount of love at this church, particularly in the last couple years, because we have a great team that plans our Paradox Kids social events. And these social events have just really brought these kids together, and they're really good friends now. They cheer for each other, they love each other, and perhaps none is more evident than the way that kids react to Griffin Cattenhorn. I mean, this kid is doted on all the time. And I was with his mother, Maddie, at one point, and she was watching these kids just say, Griffin, you're doing the best, you're doing the best. And she leans over to me and she's like, kind of worried my kid will develop a narcissistic complex. And I kind of smiled at her and I said, well, some call it a complex, others call it love. And this kid is surrounded by love. And if you missed last Saturday night, it's more than fine. But let me tell you, this kid, Griffin, made his debut on drums on this stage. And you could tell how much this kid loved it. And this church cheered for this kid, right? And Maddie texted me that night later. She texted Kimmy and me, and she said this. She said, thank you both for creating space so my child can light up and thrive the way he did tonight. Thank you so much for all your hard work on the evening and for loving our family so well. And while you may say, well, that's nice for Griffin, I will tell you that happens in a lot of stories here at Paradox. Just last week also, Olivia Ma played cello in a rock band for the first time. She had to deal with click and in-ear monitors, which, if you don't know what those are, it's a big adjustment. But Brandon and Lucy helped her along the way, and she played really well last Saturday. And when I look at our church, and the way our church gets young people involved, I will tell you, when we have guest speakers come to this church, I frequently hear from them, how do you find so many ways for young people to be involved in the service? And I said, it's just kind of the work we do. We do whatever we can to help our kids thrive and feel like they love going to church. And one of my professors at one point taught me something very valuable. And it was a difference between a healthy church and an unhealthy church. He said something along the lines of, a healthy church looks much more like a refrigerator door than an art gallery. And I don't think this metaphor holds up for Gen Z anymore, so let's say this. It looks much more like your stories than your posts. Did I get it? I tried. Just yesterday, Jasmine met with one of our newer families, the Tsukamoto family. She met with Minori, the mother. And as Minori was talking to her about her family and their experience, she was just so appreciative that her son, Luca, who's a bit more introverted, was able to run a camera right over here. And she said that she never imagined her kid could evolve this quickly. And Luca loves running a camera, and he does quite a good job. She also has an extroverted son whose name is Kai. He did the liturgy for us once. I'm pretty sure he's going to start preaching sermons soon because he's quite good at it, and he'll be doing it next week. But when Jasmine talked to Minori, Minori said, we can now picture our kids growing up in this church. And they can be here for 5 years, 10 years. We can see it because they feel so supported and they are included. And while people in the church may feel supported and that we may give love to people, I have to tell you, we also receive love on a regular basis. And I want to share a few stories about how I've received love, and I would encourage you to think about how you have received love if you've been at this church for a while. And if you're new, welcome. I would encourage you to think, what would it look like for you to receive love from a church? So, the story I want to tell you is this. We're going to start here. This is the shadow on our last service. A lot of people show up if they know you're getting fired. It's great. But it didn't always look like this. In fact, the shadow looks more like this, and a lot of my memories are this. This is Andrew Silvestri, who was playing drums today. He was leading the worship service, and you'll notice that right in front of him is a bunch of empty chairs. Well, that's not an aberration. That was pretty much the whole auditorium, right? Just lots of empty chairs. And it was pretty much my family, the Silvestris, and then the Schwelts. And the Schwelts, thank goodness they have 9 kids, because that really increases your numbers. But the Schwelts were so supportive from of day one of the shadow. And as we went through a transition to starting our own church, to going through all of the motions of the church with bylaws, to COVID, to beyond, they even moved out of state. They continue to check in with me and support me and cheer me on, and I just am so appreciative for this wonderful group of people, this family. And I still have had the honor and privilege of officiating Shannon's wedding in Chicago and then Haley's wedding just not too far from here. And I felt just so loved by this family for so many years now, and I just want to make sure that I take the time to say thank you, because what a gift this support and this love has been to me for all of this time. I think about all the way back when I was a high school pastor. Another story is I was a high school pastor, and there was a woman who was a freshman. Her name was Hillary. This is us way back. The year was 2009, if you can believe we had color photos back then. And I would lead Bible studies, and Hillary would come to these Bible studies, and she remembers me saying this at one point, and I'm surprised I said it, but she said to me, after we had started Paradox, she texted me shortly thereafter and said, I want you to know that in the Bible study you said that if the church ever goes against your morals or ever tells you that you should be silent, that you should step out and go a different direction. And she said, and you lived by what you said. And she remembered it all these years later. And I had the honor of officiating her wedding. She became our head elder back in 2020 and has stuck with it. She's been through some really tough times, and I feel just immeasurably supported and loved by this person who I've known for so long now. And I think about all the sermons she's listened to of mine. I'm like, aren't you bored? And she continues to support this church and who we are. I think about also, I went on a junior high Vespers several years ago, which is not an exciting thing to be part of at all. But I sat on the bus next to somebody I went to high school with. His name was Brandon. And we started talking about a high school ministry I was doing. And he said to me, he's like, and we talked about it and how he loved mixing sound. And after we got back from the beach, he either texted me or emailed me or maybe MySpace messaged me. It was that long ago. And he said, if you need somebody to run sound for you every week, I'll be there. And I thought, that's a nice thing to say. He meant it. He's run sound for me. He's running sound today. Yeah, I know, right? And Brandon, there's not many sound engineers that will speak at your ordination. He spoke at my ordination. We pulled off Bible camps together, One Life. Like, he's right there supporting all the work that we're doing as I'm helping kids. When the last shadow happened, Brandon wrote on the card, he's like, I'll see you at whatever's next. He was right. And while that may sound nice, at Shadow we had a Midas Pro 3 board, and we asked them to then switch to a Presonus Studio Live 24. And if you're like, what is that? I would say, it's called love. It's love. And then when we got to the point where we didn't have a place to meet just a few months ago, I started running some ideas by Brandon. He said, I'll figure out how to build a stage. And I don't know if you know this, but God didn't hang these speakers. Brandon did. And thank goodness. We didn't have a lot of options. And I just think about how much I've received from this person and how grateful I am to know him and to have him in my life. And it's all because of being part of a healthy church. Perhaps the most affection I get is from Millie Thomas. Millie, I got the honor to dedicate just a few years ago. I mean, now it's like 6 years ago, right? And I got to dedicate her at the old place, and this was right before COVID, and just watched her grow up. While COVID was happening, I might be wrong on this, so my understanding was that her kids would teach her about Jesus, and then they watched church, and it took her a while to figure out that I wasn't Jesus. Because she's like, well, be the same person, right? Was that close? That's close, yeah. And Millie now is the most, whenever this service is done, she will run up to me and give me a giant hug. And then after I put her down from this big hug, she'll say something that's new in her life, like, do you like my new boots? And I can just picture her sitting there saying, I can't wait to show Pastor Craig my new boots. And it's very nice. And then recently, she started drawing pictures of the church service. You'll notice the 4 screens here with the praise band. The drums are on the far side. And then just a couple weeks ago, Millie drew this one. Here's Millie, here's me. And then up on stage there is Karen and Alora. This is when they did liturgy. So they made it into Millie's drawing as well. And if you read it, it says, I love you so much. I love the church. Love Amelia. And it really got me. And I tell you all these stories, and I could have kept going, and I know we got to end eventually, I'm sorry. But I tell you this because a healthy church brims with stories about extraordinarily generous love. And I hope that you've experienced that in some capacity here. And I just am overwhelmed by the relationships that have formed here and just the love, the kindness, support, the understanding that has been shown to me week in and week out, and I hope that you have felt that in some way, shape, or form. I want to tell you about one more story. My wife used to work for J.D. Bilbao. He's a dentist. My wife's a dental hygienist. And he kind of heard about us all exiting one church and then starting this one. And before we started it, just a few weeks, J.D. said, "My family and I will be there." And boy, did they mean it. They showed up to just about everything. Lily runs sound for us. They even brought Megan's mom to the church. She makes food for us on a regular basis. The youngest daughter, Maya, runs sound for us at times. And then Kylie also sings for us on a regular basis when she's back from college. And then they also had their oldest daughter, Jasmine, who today is her 3-year work anniversary full-time for us. And it's been great having her. So it's your 3-year full-time anniversary. You worked 1 year part-time before then. So she's worked for us for 4 years. But this was the 3-year. Yeah, we could still clap for that. This is what happens when you surprise people. They're like, "Wasn't it 4?" It's like, yes, technically, and no, at the same time. So Jasmine has just done incredible work for this church. We often hear recently about how we're a welcoming church. It's because of the work of Jasmine. And she understands what this church is about. And when I asked her what makes a church healthy in preparation for this sermon, she said, just about everyone here can tell you why they love being part of Paradox. Hardly anyone says, "Well, it's just church." And what that means is there's not a whole lot of people going through the motions here. Some weeks you may feel like that. But people are usually here because they want to be here and they have a reason to be here. And you can use all sorts of language to talk about that. If you're in business, you'd call it your niche. If you're in religion, you would call it your calling. Whatever that is, you can call it what you want. But this allows us to be comfortable inviting people from different religions to participate in our church and to welcome them as our teachers. Not only that, but I used to say this frequently, our church used to be the only affirming church with drums within a 60-mile radius. It has since shrunk to 30 miles, which I hope it continues to shrink because the world needs more churches that are doing good work. But if one opened up down the street, just across from us or whatever, I don't think I'd worry about it too much because I feel like our church in this season is living this most authentic self. It's really being who we are because I know no matter how hard a church next door may try, they will never have Jeremy Kim on a keytar. And I just can't beat it. They will also never have pictures as beautiful as what Jordan and Summer have taken, which have basically filled this whole sermon. And I point all this out as the 11th point, that a healthy church knows its calling. It knows what it's about. And when I think about how I still believe in church and how I just won't give up this belief, it's because I really believe this is a better way to live. I think this is helpful to people. I think that understanding your role in a larger world that is created by something can help all of us to live a life of love and laughter and happiness. And so when I think about a healthy church, it's a church that loves spending time together, stands on a well-defined structure composed of committed volunteers, trusts God can be found everywhere, invites you to live with a posture of wonder, is more interested in eternal life now than eternal life later, passes the microphone test, rushes toward inclusion, grounds us in the gospel of Jesus Christ, looks more like a refrigerator door than an art gallery, brims with stories of extraordinarily generous love, and knows its calling. And if I could think of one way to symbolize that every week, it would be the sacrament of communion. No matter if this is your first time here or you attended the shadow, you are welcome to participate in this sacrament no matter what you believe, because this sacrament grounds us in the gospel message of Jesus Christ and reminds us that hope is worthwhile, that love is good, and that a church can even be healthy. My friends, may you both receive and give away the gift of healthy church. Amen.